picture canopy above. The air-towering trees stretch endlessly toward yourself, standing in what looks like an alien landscape where sky you can barely glimpse through the dents is thick and humid, almost suffocating in its intensity. Massive trunks rise around you like living skyscrapers, some so enormous that walking around just one would take you the better part of an hour. The ground beneath your feet trembles with each thunderous footstep that echoes through this primordial world. Strange calls pierce the steamy atmosphere, while shadows of incredible winged beasts dance across the forest floor. This isn't some fantasy realm from your imagination. This was Earth 145 million years ago, at the dawn of what scientists call the Early Cretaceous period. Welcome to a time when our planet was ruled terrifying that they make by creatures so magnificent and today's largest animals look like house pets. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to witness the rise of the most successful predators our planet has ever known? What drove these ancient giants to evolve into living weapons of mass destruction? And how did some herbivores develop armor so impenetrable that even the mightiest carnivores thought twice before attacking them? Today, we're diving deep into the Early Cretaceous period, a time span that lasted nearly 45 million years and fundamentally changed the course of life on Earth. This wasn't just another chapter in dinosaur evolution. This was the period that gave birth to legends, the era that produced creatures so incredible that they seem almost too fantastic to have been real. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why paleontologists consider this period to be one of the most fascinating and important chapters in Earth's history. You'll discover the shocking adulthood. You'll learn about herb training methods that young predators used to prepare for avores that could reach heights that would make modern giraffes look up in awe. And you'll uncover the secrets of armored giants that turned defense into an art form. But before we meet these incredible creatures, we need to understand the world they inhabited, because the Early Cretaceous Earth was unlike anything we see today. When the Early Cretaceous began 145 million years ago, midst of dramatic, our planet was in the transformation. The supercontinent Pangaea, which had dominated Earth's geography for millions of years, was finally breaking apart. This massive landmass split into two major continents, Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south. But the changes didn't stop there. These enormous land masses continued to fracture and drift, slowly forming the continental shapes we recognize today. The Atlantic Ocean was expanding like a giant zipper, opening between the Americas and Europe and Africa. About 110 million years ago, this oceanic expansion carved out the coastlines of North America. Meanwhile, the Indian Ocean was pushing the Indian subcontinent northward on a collision course with Asia, though that dramatic mountain-building event was still millions of years in the future. This continental drift wasn't just reshaping the map. It was creating new climates, new ocean currents, and entirely new environments for life to explore and colonize. Warm, shallow seas flooded vast areas of the continents, creating lagoons and inland waterways that became nurseries for marine life. The climate during deadly different from today's world, the Early Cretaceous, was marked. While the Late Jurassic period had ended with cooling temperatures, the early Cretaceous continued this trend for a time. Evidence suggests that snow actually fell in regions near the poles, something that seems almost impossible when we consider what came later. The tropics had become significantly wetter during the preceding Triassic and Jurassic periods, creating lush, humid environments perfect for supporting massive plant-eating dinosaurs. Despite the initial cooling, the early Cretaceous world was still warmer than our modern Earth. The combination of high humidity and elevated temperatures created a greenhouse effect that supported dense forests across much of the planet. These weren't the flower-filled forests we might imagine today, though. Flowering plants hadn't staged. Instead, the early Cretaceous forests that yet made their grand entrance onto the evolutionary were dominated by more ancient plant groups. Cycads, with their palm-like fronds, created understory layers beneath towering conifers. Ginkgo trees, ancestors of the single species that survives today, spread their distinctive fan-shaped leaves across the landscape. Tree ferns reached enormous sizes, creating cathedral-like spaces beneath their spreading fronds. One group of ferns, called Polypodiales, was particularly successful during this time, making up about 80% of all fern species. These plants had developed an evolutionary advantage that allowed them to thrive in the deep shadows cast by the forest giants above them. Their specialized photoreceptors could capture and use even the dimmest light that filtered down through the canopy, making them incredibly efficient in low-light conditions. This plant kingdom provided the foundation for one of the most spectacular displays of animal diversity our planet has ever witnessed. The herbivores that fed on these ancient forests grew to sizes that challenge our understanding of what's possible in terrestrial ecosystems. The seas of the early Cretaceous were equally transformed as the continents split apart. Warm, shallow waters spread across vast areas, creating ideal conditions for marine life to flourish. Modern sharks began to appear alongside rays and an incredible diversity of bony fish. Some of these aquatic giants, like Axelrodichthys, patrolled lagoons and freshwater systems cleaners, using their specialize as living vacuumed skulls to suck prey from crevices and rocky hiding spots. But the true rulers of these ancient waters were the marine reptiles. While a few ichthyosaurs still cruised the oceans, the incredible variety of plesiosaurs were being replaced by these weren't just larger versions of familiar animals. They represented entirely new approaches plesiosaurs, like Mac, to aquatic predation. Samira rosica evolved as high-speed pursuit predators. At about 16 feet long with relatively short necks, these animals were built for explosive speed and devastating attacks. Their teeth were masterpieces of evolutionary engineering, featuring triangular shapes with multiple grooves and ridges that could grip the slipperiest fish and tear them apart with ruthless efficiency. On the opposite end of the spectrum were species like Elasmosaurus, creatures that took the concept of a long neck to extraordinary extremes. With necks containing anywhere from 32 to 76 vertebrae, these 20-foot giants could plunge their heads deep into the water column to scoop up crustaceans and mollusks by the mouthful. Imagine a creature that could keep its body perfectly still at the surface while its head searched for food 20 feet below. The skies above these transformed landscapes were equally dynamic. True birds were beginning to share airspace with their predecessors, including populations of Archaeopteryx, those crow-sized transitional forms with their mixture of reptilian teeth and avian features. But the aerial realm was still dominated by the skies for millions of years. Osaurs, those magnificent flying reptiles that had rule among the most intriguing of these aerial predators, was Ikron Draco, a creature that looked like something straight out of a fantasy novel. This pterosaur sported a distinctive crest on its lower jaw that wasn't just for show. This specialized structure helped the animal hook and hold slippery fish, possibly even supporting a throat pouch similar to those found in modern pelicans. With skulls measuring nearly a foot long, these weren't small creatures, though their exact body size remains one of paleontology's fascinating mysteries. The terrestrial ecosystems of the early Cretaceous were bustling with activity at every level. The forest floors teemed with insects, many of which would be recognizable today. The earliest known ants were already building their complex colonial societies. Early relatives of butterflies and moths took their first tentative flights through the humid air. Grasshoppers filled the forests with their chirping songs, while various wasps and early termites played crucial roles in ecosystem functioning. These insects had already begun developing the social behaviors that make them so successful today. Paleontologists have found evidence of cooperative nest building and other group activities that mirror the complex societies we see in modern insect colonies. But impressive as these smaller creatures were, the early Cretaceous belonged to the dinosaurs. This was their golden age, a time when they achieved levels of diversity, specialization, and sheer size that have never been matched the herbivorous dinosaurs of this by any other group of terrestrial animals. Period developed some of the most extreme adaptations in the history of life on Earth. Consider Mamenchisaurus, a creature that redefined what it meant to be a long-necked dinosaur. These animals could reach lengths of 85 feet and weights of up to 80 tons. Their necks alone averaged 46 feet in length. To put that in perspective, one of these giants could peer over the roof of a 3-story building without even stretching. But Mamenchisaurus might not have held the record for the longest neck. Fragmentary remains of Seismosaurus suggest an even more extreme animal. At 118 feet long and weighing between 30 and 50 tons, this creature might have been able to extend its neck 20 feet into the air. Unfortunately, the fossil record for these giants remains incomplete, leaving us with tantalizing hints of just how large these creatures might have grown. These enormous herbivores faced constant pressure from an equally impressive array of predators. The early Cretaceous saw the rise of some of the most sophisticated and dangerous carnivorous dinosaurs ever to walk the earth. Tyrannosaurus rex was beginning to establish its dominance as the ultimate apex predator. But it wasn't the only massive carnivore stalking the early Cretaceous landscapes. These prehistoric killing machines had developed hunting strategies and physical adaptations that would make modern predators seem almost gentle by comparison. Picture a 7-ton monster with jaws powerful enough to crush a car and teeth like railroad spikes. T-Rex possessed sensory capabilities that would put modern bloodhounds to shame. Their sense aeon from miles away, while their vision of smell was so acute they could detect car was sharp enough to spot movement across vast distances. But what truly set these predators apart wasn't just their size or sensory abilities. It was their intelligence and their approach to preparing the next generation for a life of predation. Recent discoveries have revealed something absolutely shocking about young tyrannosaurs. Scientists believe these apex predators organize what can only be described as fight clubs for their juveniles. Bite marks found on fossilized skulls suggest that young T-Rex engaged in brutal training battles with each other, biting with tremendous force, but stopping short of delivering killing blows. This wasn't random aggression. This was systematic preparation for adult life as a solitary hunter in one of the most competitive ecosystems Earth has ever known. Imagine young tyrannosaurs, already the size of large cars, grappling with each other in prehistoric training grounds. The sound of their clashes would have echoed through the forests like thunder. These weren't playful scuffles. The bite marks tell us these juveniles were hitting each other with bone bee punishment while developing the killer-crushing force, learning to absorb instincts they would need to survive as adults. But T-Rex wasn't the early Cretaceous world, only massive predator prowling then. Carcharodontosaurus presented a formidable challenge to Tyrannosaurus supremacy. These shark-toothed dinosaurs were actually larger than T-Rex, reaching lengths of 26 feet and weighing over a ton. Their teeth were like serrated daggers, perfectly designed for slicing through flesh and bone. The question that haunts paleontologists is this: what would have happened if a hungry T-Rex encountered a Carcharodontosaurus in the same hunting territory? Both were apex predators, used to being the undisputed rulers of their domains. Both possessed devastating weaponry and the temperament to use it. While we can only speculate about the outcome of such an encounter, many experts believe T-Rex would have had the advantage due to its superior speed, agility, and sheer aggressiveness. The success of Tyrannosaurus rex is written in the fossil record. Scientists have calculated that over the course of their existence, approximately 2.5 billion individual T-Rex lived and died on Earth. That's billion with a B. These weren't just scattered populations hanging on in isolated pockets. These were thriving communities of apex predators that dominated ecosystems across vast geographic ranges for over 2 million years. But not every dinosaur was locked in an arms race of predation and defense. Some took a completely different evolutionary path, one that would make them nearly invulnerable to even the most determined predators. Enter Ankylosaurus, the living fortress of the dinosaur world. These incredible herbivores had evolved armor so complete and sophisticated that they were essentially immune to predation once they reached adult size. Every inch of their bodies was covered in bony plates and spikes arranged in overlapping patterns that left no weak spots. Even their skulls and the outer surfaces of their lower jaws were armored. They were like medieval knights, But instead of wearing metal armor, they had grown it as part of their bodies. These walking tanks were massive, quadrupedal creatures with short, powerful limbs and bellies that hung just 1 foot above the ground. This low-slung design gave them incredible stability and made it nearly impossible for predators to flip them over or attack their undersides. Their small, triangular teeth and long, flexible tongues allowed them to process enormous quantities of vegetation. An adult ankylosaurus could consume up to a ton of plant material every single day. But their most impressive feature was their tail weapon. Many ankylosaurus species possessed massive bony clubs at the ends of their tails that they could swing with devastating force. Imagine a wrecking ball attached to a creature the size of an elephant, controlled by muscles powerful enough to shatter the leg bones of even the largest predators. Even a hungry T-Rex would think twice before attacking a herd of these living fortresses. The herbivorous dinosaurs of the early Cretaceous also included some of the most unusual and specialized feeders ever to evolve. Struthiomimus, the ostrich mimic, represented a completely different approach to survival in a world full of massive predators. These creatures looked remarkably similar to modern ostriches, standing about 14 feet long and weighing around 330 pounds. Struthiomimus had evolved for speed above all else. Their long, powerful legs could propel them at speeds between 31 and 50 miles per hour, making them some of the fastest dinosaurs ever discovered. Their large eyes gave them excellent vision for spotting predators at a distance, while their toothless jaws were perfectly adapted for their omnivorous diet of plants, insects, and small animals. These dinosaurs had developed the ultimate survival strategy for dealing with apex predators. Don't fight them, outrun them. Their relatively short, stiff tails provided perfect balance during high-speed maneuvers, allowing them to change direction instantly while maintaining their breakneck pace. A Struthiomimus being chased by a T-Rex must have been like watching a Formula One race, with the predator's raw power pitted against the prey's superior agility and speed. The early Cretaceous period also witnessed the evolution of some truly bizarre flying reptiles that pushed the boundaries of what we thought was possible for aerial predators. These pterosaurs had developed hunting strategies and anatomical features that seem almost alien when compared to modern flying animals. Some pterosaurs developed crests and specialized jaw structures that allowed them to fish in ways no modern animal can match. They could skim along the surface of lagoons and rivers, using their lower jaw crests to hook fish directly from the water. Others developed throat pouches similar to those found in pelicans, allowing them to store multiple catches during a single hunting flight. The diversity of pterosaur hunting strategies during this period was remarkable. Some were high-altitude soaring specialists that could cover vast distances while searching for carrion. Others were agile forest hunters that could navigate through dense vegetation to catch small reptiles and mammals. Still others specialized in fishing along coastlines and riverbanks, developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for capturing aquatic prey. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of early Cretaceous ecosystems was how all these incredible creatures managed to coexist. The planet's warm, humid climate and abundant vegetation supported food chains of unprecedented complexity. Massive herbivores like Mamenchisaurus could strip the highest branches of towering conifers, while smaller species like Ankylosaurus fed on ground-level vegetation. Fast-moving omnivores like Struthiomimus filled ecological niches similar to those occupied by modern birds and small mammals. The carnivores had similarly diverse roles. Massive apex predators like T-Rex and Carcharodontosaurus competed for the largest prey, while smaller theropods specialized in hunting different types of animals or occupied different habitats. Aerial predators exploited food sources that terrestrial hunters couldn't access, while aquatic reptiles dominated the rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. This wasn't just a collection of giant monsters stumbling around a prehistoric landscape. This was a finely tuned ecosystem where every species had evolved specific adaptations that allowed them to exploit particular resources while avoiding direct competition with other species. The result was a level of biodiversity and ecological complexity that our modern world struggles to match. The mammals of the early Cretaceous were still small and relatively inconspicuous, but they were already beginning to show signs of the evolutionary innovations that would eventually make them dominant. Species like Tribosphenia looked remarkably like tiny kangaroos, complete with pouches for carrying their young. These early marsupials were covered in fur and possessed modern ear structures that suggest they had already developed sophisticated hearing abilities. Most of these early mammals lived in underground burrows where they were relatively safe from the giants that ruled the surface world. They fed on insects, small reptiles, and plant material, occupying ecological niches that the massive dinosaurs couldn't exploit. While they seemed insignificant compared to the giants around them, these small mammals were quietly developing the characteristics that would eventually allow them to inherit the Earth. The early Cretaceous period represents one of the most successful experiments in large-body evolution that our planet has ever witnessed. For nearly 45 million years, these incredible ecosystems flourished and diversified, producing creatures that seem almost too fantastic to have been real. From armored herbivores that could shrug off attacks from the most powerful predators to aerial reptiles that dominated the skies with hunting techniques unknown in the modern world, this period showcased the incredible creativity of evolutionary processes. But this golden age of giants was building toward an even more spectacular climax. As we move deeper into the Cretaceous period, we'll discover creatures that make even these early Cretaceous giants seem modest by comparison. The Late Cretaceous period would witness the evolution of the largest land predators, the most heavily armored herbivores, and the most bizarre specialists that ever walked the earth. The stage was being set for the final act in the Age of Dinosaurs, a time when these incredible creatures would reach the absolute pinnacle of their evolutionary success before facing the catastrophic event that would end their reign forever. The transformation of early Cretaceous ecosystems wasn't just about the giants that captured our imagination. It was about the intricate web of relationships that connected every living creature, from the smallest insects buzzing through the humid air to the most colossal sauropods reaching toward the canopy. Consider the daily drama that unfolded in a typical early Cretaceous forest. As dawn broke through the misty canopy, the forest would come alive with a symphony of sounds unlike anything in our modern world. The deep, rumbling calls of massive herbivores would echo through the trees as they began their morning feeding routines. These weren't random vocalizations. They were complex communication systems that allowed herds to coordinate their movements across vast territories. Mamenchisaurus herds would lift their impossibly long necks in unison, creating a forest of living periscopes scanning for the tenderest shoots at the treetops. When one individual found a particularly rich feeding area, subtle calls and body language would draw the entire group toward the bounty. These giants moved with surprising grace for their size, their massive feet finding purchase on the soft forest floor with the precision of ballet dancers. But feeding time for herbivores meant opportunity for predators. Young Tyrannosaurus rex, fresh from their brutal training sessions, would shadow these herds at a respectful distance. They had learned through painful experience that adult herbivores weren't defenseless prey. A single kick from a Mamenchisaurus could shatter bones, while the tail club of an Ankylosaurus could deliver a blow powerful enough to kill even a large predator. The hunting strategies these apex predators employed were far more sophisticated than simple brute force attacks. T-Rex had developed what can only be described as psychological warfare. They would stalk herds for days, testing the reactions of individual animals and identifying the weak, the sick, or the young. Their incredible sense of smell allowed them to detect stress hormones and illness from remarkable distances, giving them crucial information about potential targets. When a T-Rex finally made its move, the attack was swift and decisive. These predators had learned to target specific body parts for maximum effectiveness. A perfectly placed bite to the neck could sever major blood vessels, while attacks on leg joints could cripple prey and make escape impossible. The bite force of an adult T-Rex was estimated at over 12,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a small car. But successful hunts weren't guaranteed, even for apex predators. The herbivores had evolved their own sophisticated defense strategies. Ankylosaurus herds would form defensive circles with their armored backs facing outward and their deadly tail clubs ready to swing at any predator foolish enough to approach. The sound of these massive clubs whistling through the air would have been terrifying, like giant medieval maces wielded by creatures the size of elephants. Struthiomimus had perfected the art of escape and evasion. These dinosaur sprinters didn't just rely on speed. They had developed complex zigzag running patterns that made it nearly impossible for pursuing predators to anticipate their movements. Their large eyes and keen hearing allowed them to detect threats from incredible distances, often giving them crucial seconds to begin their escape before predators could close the gap. The aerial dimension of these ecosystems added another layer of complexity to the daily struggle for survival. Pterosaurs like Icra and Draco had mastered techniques that modern flying animals can barely approach. They could dive from great heights with pinpoint accuracy, snatching fish from the surface of lagoons without even getting their wings wet. Their specialized jaw crests weren't just fishing tools, they were precision instruments that allowed them to adjust their fishing technique based on water conditions, prey type, and even the time of day. Some pterosaurs had developed cooperative hunting strategies that rival those of modern dolphins or wolves. Groups would work together to herd schools of fish into shallow areas where individual hunters could maximize their success. The coordination required for such tactics suggests levels of intelligence and social organization that challenge our assumptions about reptilian cognitive abilities. The marine ecosystems of the early Cretaceous were equally dynamic and competitive. Plesiosaurs like Elasmosaurus had divided the aquatic hunting grounds into distinct territories based on their specialized feeding strategies. The long-necked species dominated the shallow lagoons and coastal areas where they could use their incredible reach to vacuum up bottom-dwelling crustaceans and mollusks. Their necks weren't just long, they were incredibly flexible, capable of bending and twisting in ways that allowed them to search every crevice and hiding spot within their reach. Meanwhile, the shorter-necked predators like Machira russica ruled the deeper waters where speed and power were more important than reach and flexibility. These marine predators had developed hunting techniques that combined stealth and explosive speed. They could remain motionless for hours, suspended in the water column like living torpedoes, before launching devastating surprise attacks on unsuspecting prey. The teeth of these aquatic predators tell fascinating stories about their hunting methods. The multiple grooves and ridges weren't random features. They were carefully evolved tools that created turbulence as prey was dragged through the water, making it nearly impossible for victims to escape once caught. Some species had developed serrated edges that worked like biological chainsaws, allowing them to process large prey items that would have been impossible to swallow whole. The insect communities of the early Cretaceous were undergoing their own evolutionary revolution. The earliest ants were experimenting with social structures that would eventually make them one of the most successful groups on the planet. These pioneer colonies were already showing signs of specialization, with different individuals taking on specific roles within the community. Some served as soldiers defending the nest, others as workers gathering food, and still others as caretakers for the developing young. The emergence of early butterflies and moths during this period represents one of evolution's most beautiful success stories. These early lepidopterans were developing the wing patterns and flight capabilities that would eventually allow them to become some of the most efficient pollinators on Earth. Their coevolution with flowering plants, which were just beginning to appear, would fundamentally reshape terrestrial ecosystems. Termites had already begun their crucial role as nature's recyclers, breaking down dead plant material and returning nutrients to the soil. Their presence in early Cretaceous ecosystems suggests that the nutrient cycles supporting the massive plant growth were already highly sophisticated. These insects weren't just surviving in the shadow of giants. They were playing essential roles that made the entire ecosystem possible. The small mammals of this period were far from passive observers of the dinosaur drama unfolding around them. Species like Tribosphenia had developed remarkably advanced parental care strategies. The pouch-bearing females could protect their young while remaining mobile enough to escape predators or search for food. This reproductive strategy gave them significant advantages over egg-laying species, allowing them to respond quickly to changing environmental conditions. These early mammals had also developed sophisticated burrowing behaviors that gave them access to ecological niches unavailable to larger animals. Their underground tunnel systems weren't just simple shelters. They were complex networks with multiple entrances, storage chambers, and nursery areas. Some species had even begun caching food for lean periods, showing levels of planning and foresight that suggest considerable intelligence. The sensory capabilities of these small mammals were already approaching modern standards. Their advanced hearing allowed them to detect the approach of predators from considerable distances, while their keen sense of smell helped them locate food sources and identify potential mates. Some species had even begun developing echolocation abilities that would later prove crucial for nocturnal hunting and navigation. The climate systems of the early Cretaceous created environmental conditions that were perfect for supporting these complex ecosystems. The greenhouse effect caused by high atmospheric carbon dioxide levels maintained warm temperatures even at the poles, eliminating the seasonal extremes that limit modern ecosystems. This climatic stability allowed species to specialize for very specific environmental niches without having to adapt to dramatic seasonal changes. The extensive shallow seas created by continental drift provided enormous areas of highly productive marine habitat. These warm, nutrient-rich waters supported food chains of incredible diversity and abundance. The constant mixing of fresh and salt water in coastal areas created unique environments that supported species found nowhere else on Earth. The volcanic activity associated with continental drift wasn't just destructive. It was also creating new land areas and adding essential minerals to soil and water systems. Many of the most productive early Cretaceous ecosystems were located in areas of recent volcanic activity, where nutrient-rich soils supported explosive plant growth. River systems during this period were unlike anything in the modern world. The lack of grass and other modern ground-covering plants meant that erosion patterns were completely different. Rivers meandered across broad floodplains, creating extensive wetland systems that supported enormous populations of aquatic and semi-aquatic species. These waterways served as highways for both marine reptiles and terrestrial animals, creating mixing zones where different ecosystems intersected. The forest canopies of the early Cretaceous represented some of the most three-dimensionally complex habitats in Earth's history. Multiple layers of vegetation created distinct microenvironments at different heights above the ground. The forest floor, dominated by ferns and fallen logs, supported communities of small reptiles, early mammals, and countless invertebrates. The understory layer, filled with cycads and smaller conifers, provided browsing opportunities for medium-sized herbivores and hunting grounds for smaller predators. The canopy layer itself was the realm of the giants. Here, The longest-necked sauropods could access food sources unavailable to any other terrestrial animals. The competition for these high-altitude resources drove the evolution of increasingly extreme neck lengths and specialized feeding adaptations. Some species developed teeth and jaw muscles specifically designed for stripping needle-like conifer leaves, while others specialized in processing the tough, fibrous fronds of tree ferns. The interactions between different species in these canopy communities were remarkably complex. Some smaller dinosaurs had developed semi-arboreal lifestyles, using their claws and lightweight builds to access food sources in the middle canopy layers. These species served as important links between the ground-dwelling and canopy-dwelling communities, helping to transfer nutrients and energy between different levels of the forest ecosystem. Pterosaurs had carved out their own specialized niches within these vertical ecosystems. Some species were canopy specialists that rarely ventured below the treetops, feeding on insects, small reptiles, and plant materials available only in the highest branches. Others were gap specialists that hunted in the clearings created by fallen giant trees or along river margins where the forest canopy was broken. The seasonal patterns of the early Cretaceous, while less extreme than modern cycles, still created important rhythms that shaped ecosystem dynamics. Wet and dry periods influenced plant growth patterns, which in turn affected herbivore movements and predator hunting strategies. Many species had developed migration patterns that allowed them to track optimal environmental conditions across vast geographic ranges. The genetic diversity present in early Cretaceous populations was extraordinary. The warm, stable climate and abundant resources allowed species to maintain large population sizes across extensive ranges. This genetic richness provided the raw material for rapid evolutionary adaptation when environmental conditions changed. It also created the foundation for the explosive diversification that would characterize the later Cretaceous period. Communication systems among early Cretaceous dinosaurs were far more sophisticated than previously imagined. Recent discoveries suggest that many species used complex vocalizations, visual displays, and even chemical signals to coordinate group behaviors, establish territories, and attract mates. Some herbivorous species had developed early warning systems that could alert entire herds to the presence of predators from remarkable distances. The evidence for these communication networks comes from studying the internal structure of dinosaur skulls and the discovery of specialized sound-producing organs. Some species possessed resonating chambers that could amplify low-frequency calls, allowing them to communicate across the dense forests and over the noise of their massive footsteps. Others had developed visual display structures that could be rapidly changed to convey different types of information to other members of their species. These early Cretaceous ecosystems represented the pinnacle of large-body terrestrial evolution. Never before or since has our planet supported such a diverse array of massive land animals living in such close proximity. The delicate balance between predation pressure, resource availability, and environmental stability created conditions that allowed these incredible communities to flourish for tens of millions of years. But this golden age was building toward something even more spectacular as environmental conditions continued to change and evolutionary pressures intensified. The stage was being set for the emergence of creatures that would push the boundaries of what was biologically possible even further. The Late Cretaceous period was approaching, and with it would come the most extreme examples of predation, defense, and specialization in the history of terrestrial life. The foundations laid during the Early Cretaceous had created evolutionary trajectories that would culminate in creatures of almost mythical proportions. The arms race between predators and prey was accelerating, driving the development of increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques and ever more impregnable defensive systems. The next chapter in this incredible story would witness the rise of creatures so specialized and extreme that they would represent the absolute pinnacle of dinosaur evolution before the catastrophic events that would end their remarkable reign forever. The evolutionary arms race that defined the Early Cretaceous wasn't just about size and strength. It was about intelligence, strategy, and the development of hunting techniques that would make modern predators seem primitive by comparison. The apex predators of this period had evolved cognitive abilities that allowed them to plan complex hunting strategies, coordinate attacks with other individuals, and even use tools in ways that challenge our understanding of reptilian intelligence. Consider the hunting behavior of Carcharodontosaurus, those massive shock-toothed predators that rivaled T-Rex for dominance. These creatures hadn't just evolved devastating physical weapons. They had developed sophisticated ambush techniques that required remarkable patience and strategic thinking. Fossil evidence suggests they would position themselves near water sources and game trails, sometimes waiting motionless for hours before launching their attacks. The bite patterns found on fossil bones reveal that these predators understood anatomy in ways that seem almost surgical. They knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage while minimizing their own risk. Some bite marks show evidence of what can only be described as systematic dismemberment, where predators would methodically disable their prey by targeting specific joints and muscle groups before delivering the killing blow. But perhaps most remarkably, some species appear to have developed rudimentary tool use. Scratch marks on certain fossils suggest that some theropods used rocks and fallen branches to help process their prey, or even to crack open the armored shells of heavily defended herbivores. This level of problem-solving ability indicates cognitive capabilities that we're only beginning to understand. The social dynamics of early Cretaceous predator communities were equally complex. While T-Rex is often portrayed as a solitary hunter, growing evidence suggests that at least some individuals engaged in cooperative behaviors during certain phases of their lives. Young adults may have formed temporary hunting partnerships that allowed them to take down prey too large or dangerous for a single predator to handle safely. These cooperative hunting groups weren't random associations. They appear to have been carefully organized partnerships where individual roles were clearly defined. Some members would serve as drivers, herding prey toward ambush positions, while others would act as the primary attackers. The coordination required for such strategies suggests levels of communication and social organization that rival those found in modern pack-hunting mammals. The herbivorous giants of the early Cretaceous had responded to this predation pressure by developing defensive strategies that went far beyond simple size and armor. Many species had evolved complex herd behaviors that created nearly impenetrable defensive formations. When threatened, these herds would arrange themselves in patterns that maximized the defensive capabilities of each individual while minimizing vulnerable positions. Mamenchisaurus herds, for example, would form defensive circles with the adults on the outside and juveniles protected in the center. But this wasn't a static formation. The herd could shift and flow like a living organism, always keeping the most vulnerable individual protected while presenting a wall of massive bodies and deadly necks to potential attackers. The coordination required for these maneuvers was extraordinary, requiring sophisticated communication systems and split-second timing. Some herbivorous species had even developed what can only be described as counter-attack strategies. Rather than simply defending against predators, they would actively pursue and attempt to eliminate threats to their herds. Ankylosaurus groups were particularly effective at this, using their massive tail clubs to drive predators away from feeding and nesting areas. The psychological impact of facing a coordinated charge by several multi-ton armored herbivores must have been enough to discourage all but the most desperate or experienced predators. The feeding behaviors of these herbivorous giants had created ecosystem effects that shaped entire landscapes. The massive sauropods weren't just passive consumers of vegetation. They were active ecosystem engineers that modified their environments in ways that benefited countless other species. Their feeding activities created clearings in dense forests, allowing sunlight to reach the forest floor and promoting the growth of understory plants that supported smaller herbivores. The digestive processes of these giants also played crucial roles in nutrient cycling. A single large sauropod could process and redistribute several tons of plant material every day, breaking down tough plant fibers and depositing nutrient-rich waste across vast areas. This biological fertilization process was essential for maintaining the productivity of early Cretaceous ecosystems. Many sauropod species had developed highly specialized digestive systems that allowed them to extract maximum nutrition from poor quality plant materials. Some possessed multiple stomach chambers, similar to modern ruminants, where symbiotic bacteria helped break down cellulose and other tough plant compounds. Others had evolved specialized gut bacteria that could process toxic plant compounds, allowing them to feed on vegetation that would be deadly to other species. The migration patterns of these herbivorous giants created seasonal rhythms that affected entire continental ecosystems. Some species would travel thousands of miles following optimal feeding conditions, creating corridors of disturbed vegetation and concentrated nutrients that other species could exploit. These migration routes became highways for smaller animals, creating mixing zones where different regional ecosystems could interact and exchange genetic material. The flying reptiles of the early Cretaceous had achieved levels of aerial mastery that seem almost impossible by modern standards. Some pterosaur species had developed wingspans that exceeded 40 feet, making them larger than many modern aircraft. These giants weren't just impressive for their size. They had evolved flight capabilities that allowed them to soar for days without landing, covering vast distances while expending minimal energy. The largest pterosaurs had developed specialized flight techniques that took advantage of thermal currents and wind patterns in ways that modern birds can barely approach. They could gain altitude by riding rising columns of warm air, then glide for hundreds of miles using high-altitude wind streams. This allowed them to patrol enormous territories while searching for food sources that were scattered across vast geographic ranges. Some pterosaur species had evolved to become specialized scavengers, using their incredible flying abilities to locate carcasses from remarkable distances. Their keen eyesight could spot carrion from miles away, while their powerful wings allowed them to reach feeding sites before ground-based competitors. These aerial scavengers played crucial roles in preventing disease outbreaks by rapidly removing dead animals from the ecosystem. But not all pterosaurs were giants focused on long-distance flight. Many species had evolved for precision, flying in cluttered environments like dense forests or narrow river valleys. These smaller pterosaurs possessed incredible maneuverability, capable of executing flight patterns that would challenge modern military aircraft. They could dive through forest canopies at high speeds, navigate between massive tree trunks, and execute sharp turns that would create G-forces sufficient to incapacitate most other flying animals. The hunting techniques developed by these agile pterosaurs were remarkably diverse. Some species had perfected the art of snatching prey from treetops while flying at full speed, using specialized claws that could grip and release with lightning reflexes. Others had developed techniques for fishing in fast-moving rivers, diving at precise angles to snatch fish from turbulent water without losing control of their flight. The aquatic ecosystems of the early Cretaceous supported marine reptile communities of unprecedented diversity and specialization. The warm, shallow seas created by continental drift provided ideal conditions for the evolution of creatures that pushed the boundaries of aquatic adaptation. These weren't just larger versions of modern marine animals. They represented entirely new approaches to life in aquatic environments. Some plesiosaur species had evolved to become the aquatic equivalent of modern filter feeders, using their long necks and specialized jaw structures to strain vast quantities of small prey from the water column. Their feeding techniques were so efficient that they could process thousands of individual prey items in a single feeding session, extracting maximum nutrition from the abundant but small food sources available in early Cretaceous waters. Other marine reptiles had taken the opposite approach, becoming ultra-specialized predators that focused on specific types of large prey. Some species had evolved jaws and teeth specifically designed for crushing the shells of large marine mollusks, while others had developed techniques for hunting other marine reptiles. The diversity of predation strategies represented in early Cretaceous marine communities rivals that found in any modern ocean system. The sensory capabilities of these aquatic predators were extraordinary. Some species had developed echolocation abilities that allowed them to hunt in murky water or during night hours. Others possessed electroreceptive organs that could detect the bioelectric fields generated by other animals, making it nearly impossible for prey to hide even when buried in sediment or concealed among vegetation. The reproductive strategies of early Cretaceous marine reptiles show remarkable sophistication in dealing with the challenges of aquatic life. Some species had developed techniques for constructing underwater nests in protected areas, while others had evolved to give birth to live young in open water. These reproductive innovations allowed marine reptiles to exploit aquatic environments more completely than any previous group of vertebrates. The smaller inhabitants of early Cretaceous ecosystems were undergoing their own evolutionary revolution, developing innovations that would eventually prove crucial for the future of life on Earth. The early mammals of this period were experimenting with reproductive strategies, sensory capabilities, and ecological adaptations that were laying the groundwork for mammalian dominance in later geological periods. Some early Cretaceous mammals had already begun developing the sophisticated thermoregulation systems that would eventually become one of their greatest evolutionary advantages. Their fur wasn't just simple insulation. It was a complex system of different hair types that could be adjusted to maintain optimal body temperature across a wide range of environmental conditions. This thermal control gave them significant advantages over reptilian competitors in certain ecological niches. The parental care behaviors of these early mammals were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Some species had developed extended nursing periods that allowed parents to transfer not just nutrition, but also learned behaviors to their offspring. This cultural transmission of information was creating the foundation for the complex social behaviors that would eventually characterize many mammalian lineages. The sensory capabilities of early Cretaceous mammals were already approaching, and in some cases exceeding those of modern species. Their hearing was particularly advanced, with some species capable of detecting ultrasonic frequencies that were completely inaudible to reptilian predators. This auditory sensitivity gave them crucial advantages in detecting approaching threats and locating prey in dense vegetation or underground environments. Some mammalian species had begun developing primitive echolocation abilities that allowed them to navigate and hunt in complete darkness. These early biosonar systems weren't as sophisticated as those found in modern bats and dolphins, but they represented the first steps toward one of evolution's most remarkable sensory innovations. The insect communities of the early Cretaceous were experiencing explosive diversification as they co-evolved with the changing plant communities around them. The emergence of flowering plants, while still in its early stages, was creating new ecological opportunities that insects were quick to exploit. The first primitive pollinators were developing specialized relationships with early flowering plants, creating mutually beneficial partnerships that would eventually reshape terrestrial ecosystems. Social insects like ants and termites were perfecting the colonial behaviors that would make them among the most successful groups on the planet. Their colonies were becoming increasingly sophisticated, with specialized castes, complex communication systems, and coordinated behaviors that allowed them to exploit resources unavailable to solitary species. These early social insects were already demonstrating the power of cooperation and specialization that would eventually allow them to dominate many terrestrial ecosystems. The predatory insects of the early Cretaceous had evolved hunting techniques that rivaled those of much larger predators. Some species had developed ambush strategies that involved constructing elaborate traps, while others had evolved to become specialized pursuit predators capable of chasing down prey over considerable distances. The diversity of hunting techniques represented among early Cretaceous insects demonstrates the incredible adaptability and evolutionary potential of this group. Flying insects were pushing the boundaries of aerial performance in ways that seemed spans that exceeded those of many almost impossible by modern standards. Some species had developed winged modern birds, while others had evolved flight capabilities that allowed them to perform aerial maneuvers that would challenge modern helicopter pilots. These flying insects weren't just impressive for their size and agility. They had developed sophisticated navigation systems that allowed them to travel vast distances while maintaining precise directional control. The plant communities of the early Cretaceous were laying the foundation for modern terrestrial ecosystems through innovations in structure, reproduction, and chemical defense. The gymnosperm forests that dominated this period were far more complex and diverse than previously understood, with different species occupying highly specialized ecological niches based on their particular adaptations to light, water, and soil conditions. Some coniferous species had evolved to become specialists in nutrient-poor soils, developing symbiotic relationships with fungi that allowed them to extract essential minerals from substrates that would be uninhabitable for most other plants. These partnerships were creating the foundation for the complex soil ecosystems that would eventually support the incredible diversity of modern forest communities. The chemical warfare being waged between plants and their herbivorous consumers was reaching new levels of sophistication. Many plant species had evolved complex cocktails of toxic compounds that could deter herbivores while remaining harmless to beneficial insects and other organisms. Some plants had even developed the ability to produce different toxins in response to specific types of herbivore damage, creating dynamic defense systems that could adapt to changing threats. The early flowering plants that were beginning to appear during the later part of the early Cretaceous represented one of evolution's most successful innovations. These pioneers were developing reproductive strategies that would eventually allow them to dominate terrestrial plant communities worldwide. Their flowers weren't just attractive decorations. They were sophisticated biological machines designed to attract specific pollinators while maximizing reproductive success. The coevolution between early flowering plants and their insect pollinators was creating feedback loops that accelerated the evolutionary pace for both groups. As flowers became more specialized for particular pollinators, the insects evolved increasingly sophisticated adaptations for accessing floral rewards. This arms race of specialization was driving the rapid diversification that would characterize both flowering plants and insects throughout the rest of the Mesozoic era. The climate systems of the early Cretaceous were creating environmental conditions that were perfect for this biological experimentation and diversification. The greenhouse conditions maintained by high atmospheric carbon dioxide levels eliminated the seasonal extremes that limit modern ecosystems, allowing species to specialize for very narrow environmental niches without having to maintain the flexibility needed to survive dramatic seasonal changes. Ocean circulation patterns during this period were distributing heat and nutrients in ways that created highly productive marine ecosystems across vast areas of the planet. The extensive shallow seas provided enormous areas of warm, nutrient-rich habitat that supported food chains of incredible complexity and abundance. These marine ecosystems were serving as evolutionary laboratories where new forms of life could experiment with adaptations that would prove crucial in later geological periods. The volcanic activity associated with continental breakup was adding essential nutrients to both terrestrial and marine ecosystems, while creating new land areas that could be colonized by pioneering species. Rather than being purely destructive, this geological activity was providing the raw materials needed to support the incredible biological productivity that characterized early Cretaceous ecosystems. River systems during this period were creating vast wetland complexes that served as mixing zones where terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems could interact. These wetlands were among the most biologically productive environments on the planet, supporting enormous populations of both resident species and migrants that used these areas during seasonal movements. The absence of ice caps meant that sea levels were much higher than today, creating extensive coastal plain environments that were perfect for supporting large, herbivorous dinosaurs. These coastal plains provided vast areas of uniform habitat, where herds of giant herbivores could roam freely while following seasonal patterns of plant growth and reproduction. The early Cretaceous world was a planet in perfect balance, where warm climates, abundant resources, and stable environmental conditions created the foundation for biological diversity and specialization on a scale that has never been matched before or since. This was evolution's greatest experiment in large-body terrestrial life, a time when the fundamental constraints that limit modern ecosystems were temporarily relaxed, allowing life to explore possibilities that seem almost fantastical by today's standards. But this golden age of biological experimentation was building toward an even more spectacular climax. The environmental conditions that had made the early Cretaceous such a successful period for large-body evolution were continuing to change, creating new opportunities and challenges that would drive even more extreme adaptations. The Late Cretaceous period was approaching, bringing with it creatures that would represent the absolute pinnacle of dinosaur evolution and the final chapter in one of the most remarkable periods in Earth's biological history. The innovations and evolutionary experiments of the early Cretaceous had created the foundation for what was to come. The arms race between predators and prey was accelerating. The specialization of different ecological roles was becoming more extreme, and the overall complexity of ecosystems was reaching levels that would challenge the limits of what was biologically possible. The stage was set for the emergence of creatures so specialized and extreme that they would push the boundaries of terrestrial life to their absolute limits before the catastrophic events that would end this incredible evolutionary experiment forever. The seasonal rhythms that governed early Cretaceous life created spectacles that would dwarf anything witnessed in our modern world. Picture the arrival of the wet season in what would one day become North America. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Rivers that had been modest streams during the dry months would swell into raging torrents, carving new channels and creating temporary lakes that stretched to the horizon. These seasonal floods weren't destructive events. They were the lifeblood of the ecosystem, carrying essential nutrients across vast distances and creating the conditions that supported the incredible abundance of life that characterized this period. Massive herds of herbivorous dinosaurs would time their migrations to coincide with these floods, following the advancing waters as they brought fresh vegetation and new feeding opportunities. The sight of thousands of Mamenchisaurus moving across the landscape during these seasonal migrations must have been beyond imagination. Their necks would create a moving forest of flesh and bone, swaying in unison as the herd navigated obstacles and searched for optimal feeding grounds. The ground would tremble under the combined weight of these giants, their footsteps creating a rhythmic thunder that could be heard for miles. But these migrations weren't chaotic stampedes. They were carefully orchestrated movements guided by environmental cues that these animals had learned to read with remarkable precision. Changes in atmospheric pressure, shifts in wind patterns, and subtle alterations in plant chemistry would signal the optimal timing for these massive relocations. The herds would begin gathering weeks before the actual movement, with individuals traveling from across the continent to join the seasonal procession. The predators that shadowed these migrating herds had developed their own sophisticated strategies for exploiting these predictable movements. Tyrannosaurus rex would position themselves along traditional migration routes, waiting in carefully chosen ambush positions where geography would funnel the herds into vulnerable configurations. These apex predators had learned the migration pattern so well that they could predict exactly where and when the most vulnerable individuals would be accessible. Young T-Rex, still learning the art of predation from their elders, would use these migration periods as intensive training opportunities. The abundance of potential prey and the presence of experienced hunters created perfect conditions for developing the skills they would need to survive as solitary adults. These learning experiences weren't just about hunting techniques. They were comprehensive educations in reading animal behavior, understanding herd dynamics, and recognizing the subtle signs that indicated when an attack would be most likely to succeed. The coastal regions during these seasonal transitions became theaters of incredible drama as inland flooding drove terrestrial animals toward higher ground. The boundaries between land and sea became zones of intense competition and opportunity. Marine reptiles like Elasmosaurus would venture into the shallow coastal waters, taking advantage of the increased abundance of prey that had been displaced by the changing water levels. These coastal mixing zones created some of the most complex predator-prey interactions in the early Cretaceous world. Pterosaurs would patrol the shorelines in vast numbers, their keen eyes scanning for fish that had been stranded in tidal pools or driven into shallow water by the massive marine predators below. The aerial battles between different pterosaur species competing for the same fishing grounds would fill the skies with creatures engaged in aerial maneuvers that seem impossible by modern standards. Some pterosaur species had developed specialized techniques for cooperative fishing that required remarkable coordination and communication. Groups of these flying reptiles would work together to herd schools of fish into shallow areas where individual hunters could maximize their success. The precision timing required for these cooperative hunts suggests levels of intelligence and social organization that challenge our understanding of reptilian cognitive abilities. The plant communities of the early Cretaceous were responding to these seasonal rhythms with their own remarkable adaptations. Many species had evolved to concentrate their reproductive activities during the optimal periods when conditions were perfect for seed dispersal and germination. The timing of these reproductive cycles was so precise that entire forests would burst into reproductive activity within days of each other, creating synchronized events that supported massive populations of insects and other small animals. The chemical communication systems that plants use to coordinate these reproductive events were incredibly sophisticated. Trees could detect airborne chemical signals released by other individuals of their species, allowing them to synchronize their activities across vast forest areas. This coordination wasn't just about reproduction. Plants would also coordinate their defensive responses to herbivore attacks, creating forest-wide changes in leaf chemistry that could affect the behavior and distribution of herbivorous dinosaurs. The soil ecosystems that supported these plant communities were among the most complex and productive in Earth's history. The combination of warm temperatures, abundant moisture, and constant input of organic matter from the massive herbivores above created conditions perfect for supporting incredibly diverse communities of soil organisms. These underground ecosystems were processing nutrients and organic matter at rates that seem almost impossible by modern standards. Fungal networks in early Cretaceous soils had evolved to incredible levels of complexity, creating underground communication systems that connected plants across vast areas. These fungal networks could transfer nutrients between different plant species, share information about environmental conditions, and even coordinate defensive responses to threats. The underground world was as sophisticated and interconnected as the dramatic ecosystems visible above the surface. The insect communities that thrived in these rich soil environments had developed some of the most remarkable life cycles and behavioral adaptations in the history of terrestrial life. Some species had evolved to spend multiple years underground as larvae, emerging as adults only when conditions were optimal for reproduction. These synchronized emergences would create spectacular events when millions of insects would simultaneously transform from their larval stages, filling the air with clouds of flying adults. The predatory insects that specialized in hunting these emerging swarms had developed their own incredible adaptations. Some species could detect the chemical signals that indicated when mass emergences were about to occur, allowing them to position themselves optimally before the feeding frenzy began. Others had evolved to become specialists in aerial hunting, developing flight capabilities that allowed them to capture prey while both predator and prey were flying at high speeds. The aquatic ecosystems of the early Cretaceous were equally dynamic during these seasonal transitions. The massive inputs of fresh water and nutrients from seasonal flooding created conditions that supported explosive growth of aquatic plant communities and the animals that depended on them. Rivers and lakes would transform from clear water systems to rich, productive ecosystems teeming with life. Marine reptiles had learned to time their own reproductive cycles to coincide with these periods of maximum aquatic productivity. The abundance of food during these seasonal peaks allowed females to accumulate the resources needed for egg production and the extended parental care that some species provided to their young. The nursery areas where these marine giants raised their offspring were among the most protected and productive environments in the early Cretaceous world. The feeding strategies that different marine reptile species had evolved were remarkably diverse and sophisticated. Some plesiosaurs had become specialists in hunting during the turbulent conditions created by seasonal storms and flooding. Their ability to navigate and hunt effectively in rough water gave them access to prey that was unavailable to other predators, creating ecological niches that supported remarkable levels of specialization. Other marine species had evolved to exploit the seasonal movements of their prey, following schools of fish and other marine animals as they migrated between different habitat zones. These marine predators had developed navigation abilities that allowed them to track prey across vast oceanic distances, using environmental cues that we're only beginning to understand. The reproductive behaviors of early Cretaceous marine reptiles show remarkable sophistication in timing and location selection. Many species would travel thousands of miles to reach specific breeding areas where conditions were optimal for offspring survival. These breeding migrations created seasonal concentrations of marine life that supported complex ecosystems based entirely on the reproductive activities of these giant reptiles. The nesting behaviors of terrestrial dinosaurs during this period were equally remarkable for their complexity and the level of parental care they involved. Many species had evolved to create elaborate nest structures that provided optimal conditions for egg incubation while protecting the developing embryos from predators and environmental extremes. These nests weren't simple scrapes in the ground. They were sophisticated structures that incorporated temperature regulation, drainage systems, and defensive features. Some herbivorous dinosaur species had developed communal nesting strategies where multiple females would construct their nests in close proximity, creating colonial breeding areas that could be more effectively defended against predators. These nesting colonies would attract their own specialized communities of smaller animals that exploited the resources and protection provided by the nesting giants. The predatory dinosaurs that specialized in raiding these nesting colonies had evolved their own remarkable adaptations for this dangerous but rewarding activity. Nest raiding required different skills than hunting adult prey, demanding stealth, precision, and the ability to escape quickly when discovered by protective parents. Some predator species had evolved to become specialists in this high-risk, high-reward lifestyle. The parental care behaviors displayed by many early Cretaceous dinosaur species were far more sophisticated than previously imagined. Some species provided extended care for their offspring, teaching young animals essential survival skills through complex behavioral interactions. These learning processes weren't just about basic survival skills. They included sophisticated lessons in social behavior, environmental awareness, and even primitive forms of tool use. The communication systems that facilitated these complex parent-offspring relationships were remarkably advanced. Many dinosaur species had evolved elaborate vocal repertoires that allowed them to convey detailed information about environmental conditions, potential threats, and behavioral instructions. Some species had even developed what can only be described as primitive languages, with different vocalizations having specific meanings that were understood by all members of the social group. The territorial behaviors of early Cretaceous dinosaurs created complex social landscapes that influenced the distribution and behavior of entire ecosystems. Many species had evolved elaborate territorial display behaviors that allowed them to establish and maintain control over specific areas without engaging in dangerous physical conflicts. These display behaviors often involved complex combinations of vocalizations, visual signals, and even choreographed movements that could convey detailed information about an individual's size, health, and fighting ability. The boundaries between different territorial holdings created invisible maps that governed the movements and interactions of countless species. These territorial systems weren't static. They were dynamic networks that changed seasonally and in response to environmental conditions, creating ever-shifting patterns of resource availability and competitive pressure. Some dinosaur species had evolved to exploit the edges and boundaries between different territories, taking advantage of the reduced competition and increased resource availability found in these transitional zones. These edge specialists had developed behavioral adaptations that allowed them to move quickly between different territorial holdings while avoiding direct confrontation with the residents. The scavenging communities that followed the great herds of herbivorous dinosaurs were complex ecosystems in their own right. Multiple species of pterosaurs, small theropods, and early mammals had evolved to exploit different aspects of the feeding opportunities created by the giants. Some specialized in fresh carcasses, others in partially decomposed remains, and still others in the insect communities that thrived in the rich organic matter left behind by the herds. These scavenging communities had developed their own social hierarchies and competitive relationships. Large pterosaurs would dominate fresh carcasses, using their size and aerial mobility to exclude ground-based competitors. Smaller species would wait their turn, often forming temporary associations that allowed them to overwhelm larger competitors through coordinated group actions. The nutrient cycling effects of these scavenging communities were essential for maintaining ecosystem productivity. By rapidly processing organic matter and redistributing nutrients across the landscape, these communities prevented the accumulation of dead material that could harbor disease organisms or create fire hazards. Their activities were crucial for maintaining the health and stability of early Cretaceous ecosystems. The disease dynamics of early Cretaceous ecosystems were remarkably sophisticated, with complex interactions between pathogens, hosts, and environmental factors, creating selective pressures that drove evolutionary adaptation. Many dinosaur species had evolved immune systems that were capable of dealing with the unique challenges posed by living in high-density populations of massive animals. Some species had developed behavioral adaptations that reduced disease transmission, including grooming behaviors, territorial spacing, and even primitive forms of quarantine, where sick individuals would be excluded from social groups. These disease prevention strategies were essential for maintaining the health of the large populations that characterized many early Cretaceous species. The co-evolutionary relationships between parasites and their dinosaur hosts had reached remarkable levels of specialization. Many parasite species had evolved to exploit specific aspects of dinosaur biology, from the unique chemistry of their blood to the particular microenvironments created by their massive bodies. These host-parasite relationships weren't simply antagonistic. In many cases, they had evolved into complex partnerships where both species benefited from their association. The sensory worlds experienced by early Cretaceous animals were far richer and more complex than we can easily imagine. Many species had evolved sensory capabilities that allowed them to perceive environmental features that are completely invisible to modern animals. Some dinosaurs could detect infrasonic vibrations traveling through the ground, allowing them to communicate over vast distances or detect the approach of other massive animals from miles away. The visual systems of many early Cretaceous species were adapted to the unique lighting conditions created by the dense forest canopies and frequent atmospheric moisture. Some species had evolved to see ultraviolet patterns that were invisible to their predators or prey, creating secret communication channels that could be used for mate selection or territorial displays. Chemical communication systems had reached incredible levels of sophistication, with many species capable of detecting and interpreting complex chemical signatures that conveyed detailed information about identity, health status, reproductive condition, and even emotional state. These chemical communication networks created invisible information highways that connected animals across vast distances and allowed for coordination of activities on continental scales. The magnetic navigation abilities that some species had evolved allowed them to maintain precise directional orientation during long-distance migrations or while navigating in dense forest environments where visual landmarks were unavailable. These biological compass systems were so accurate that some species could return to specific locations after traveling thousands of miles across unfamiliar terrain. The temporal organization of early Cretaceous ecosystems was remarkably complex. with different species active at different times of day and different seasons, creating temporal niches that reduced competition and maximized resource utilization. Some species had evolved to be active during specific phases of lunar cycles, while others timed their activities to coincide with particular weather patterns or atmospheric conditions. These temporal patterns created rhythms that governed entire ecosystems, with waves of activity passing through different groups of organisms in predictable sequences. The precision of these temporal relationships suggests levels of environmental sensitivity and biological coordination that rival the most sophisticated modern ecosystems. The learning and cultural transmission behaviors that characterize many early Cretaceous species were creating the first examples of non-genetic inheritance in terrestrial vertebrates. Young animals weren't just inheriting their parents' genes. They were also inheriting learned behaviors, environmental knowledge, and even primitive forms of technology that had been passed down through multiple generations. These cultural inheritance systems were creating evolutionary feedback loops where learned behaviors could influence genetic evolution and vice versa. Species that had developed effective cultural transmission systems were gaining significant advantages over those that relied solely on genetic inheritance, creating selective pressures that favored increased intelligence and social sophistication. The tool use behaviors that had evolved in some early Cretaceous species were far more sophisticated than simple stick or rock manipulation. Some species had learned to modify their environments in ways that improved their access to food resources or provided protection from predators. These environmental modifications were being passed down through cultural transmission, creating the first examples of cumulative technological evolution in non-human species. The problem-solving abilities displayed by many early Cretaceous animals were remarkable for their creativity and flexibility. Some species could adapt their behavior to novel situations, develop new solutions to environmental challenges, and even engage in what appears to be abstract reasoning about cause and effect relationships. These cognitive abilities weren't limited to the largest or most advanced species. Even relatively small dinosaurs and early mammals had evolved remarkable problem-solving capabilities that allowed them to exploit environmental opportunities that would have been unavailable to less intelligent species. The intelligence revolution of the early Cretaceous was creating new forms of ecological competition based on cognitive rather than just physical adaptations. The emotional lives of early Cretaceous animals were far richer than previously imagined, with growing evidence for complex emotional states, including grief, joy, curiosity, and even primitive forms of aesthetic appreciation. Some species engaged in play behaviors that served no obvious survival function, but appeared to provide psychological benefits, similar to those observed in modern intelligent animals. The social bonds formed between individuals of some species were remarkably strong and long-lasting, with evidence for friendships, partnerships, and even mourning behaviors when companions were lost. These emotional connections weren't just found in closely related individuals. Some species formed cross-species relationships that provided mutual benefits and appeared to involve genuine affection between very different types of animals. The artistic behaviors displayed by some early Cretaceous species included elaborate nest decorations, territorial displays that incorporated aesthetic elements, and even primitive forms of music created through complex vocalizations that seemed to serve no function beyond their beauty. These behaviors suggest that the appreciation of beauty and the creation of art may be far more ancient and widespread than previously thought. The mathematical abilities that some species had developed included sophisticated spatial reasoning, timing calculations, and even primitive counting skills that allowed them to keep track of group members or food resources. These cognitive abilities were being used to solve complex logistical problems related to group coordination, resource management, and territorial organization. The memory capabilities of many early Cretaceous species were extraordinary, with some individuals capable of remembering specific locations, events, and relationships over periods of many years. These long-term memory systems were essential for the complex social relationships and environmental knowledge that characterized many species during this period. The forward planning abilities that had evolved in some species allowed them to engage in behaviors that would provide benefits only in the distant future. Some species would cache food resources in anticipation of seasonal shortages, while others would modify their environments in ways that would improve conditions for their offspring years later. The early Cretaceous period represents the pinnacle of biological experimentation and evolutionary creativity in Earth's history. The combination of optimal environmental conditions, abundant resources, and relaxed ecological constraints had created opportunities for life to explore possibilities that seem almost limitless in their scope and sophistication. But this incredible evolutionary experiment was building toward an even more spectacular climax. The innovations and adaptations that had emerged during the early Cretaceous were laying the groundwork for even more extreme specializations and remarkable creatures that would define the Late Cretaceous period. The arms race between predators and prey was accelerating. The complexity of ecological relationships was reaching new heights, and the stage was being set for the emergence of creatures that would represent the absolute pinnacle of dinosaur evolution before the catastrophic events that would end this remarkable chapter in the history of life on Earth. The technological innovations that had emerged among early Cretaceous species were creating the first examples of what could only be described as prehistoric engineering. Some dinosaur species had learned to construct elaborate water management systems, diverting streams and creating artificial pools that provided reliable water sources during dry periods. These weren't simple damming behaviors. They were sophisticated hydraulic projects that demonstrated understanding of water flow dynamics and long-term planning capabilities. The construction techniques employed by these engineering species involved coordinated group efforts where different individuals took on specialized roles. Some would serve as material gatherers, collecting rocks and vegetation for construction. Others would act as architects, directing the placement of materials to achieve optimal water flow patterns. Still others would function as quality control inspectors, testing the structures and making adjustments to ensure they would function effectively under different environmental conditions. These engineering projects weren't just functional. They were creating entirely new microhabitats that supported communities of smaller animals that couldn't have survived in the original environment. The artificial wetlands created by dinosaur construction activities became nurseries for fish populations, breeding grounds for amphibians, and feeding areas for countless species of insects and other invertebrates. The maintenance behaviors associated with these construction projects were equally sophisticated. The builder species would return regularly to inspect their creations, making repairs and modifications as needed. Some structures were maintained for decades, with successive generations of builders inheriting both the physical structures and the knowledge needed to keep them functional. The communication systems that coordinated these group construction projects were remarkably complex. Different types of calls were used to signal different phases of the construction process, coordinate the movements of multiple individuals, and even convey specific technical information about structural requirements. These construction vocabularies were being passed down through cultural transmission, creating technological traditions that persisted across multiple generations. Some herbivorous species had developed agricultural behaviors that went far beyond simple seed dispersal. They would actively cultivate specific plant species by creating optimal growing conditions, protecting young plants from competitors, and even engaging in primitive forms of selective breeding by preferentially consuming plants with undesirable characteristics while allowing superior specimens to reproduce. These agricultural activities were creating landscape-scale changes that transformed entire ecosystems. Areas under dinosaur cultivation would develop distinctive plant communities that were more productive and nutritious than the natural vegetation. These managed landscapes could support much higher densities of herbivorous animals, creating positive feedback loops that encouraged further agricultural development. The crop rotation systems employed by some species were surprisingly sophisticated, with different plant species being cultivated in sequence to maintain soil fertility and prevent the buildup of plant-specific diseases. These rotation schedules were timed to coincide with seasonal environmental changes, maximizing the productivity of the managed areas while minimizing the labor investment required for maintenance. The storage behaviors that had evolved in conjunction with these agricultural systems allowed some species to accumulate food surpluses that could sustain them through periods of environmental stress. Underground storage facilities were constructed using the same engineering principles employed in water management projects, creating climate-controlled environments that could preserve plant materials for extended periods. The social hierarchies that governed access to these stored resources were complex and sophisticated, with elaborate behavioral protocols determining how surplus food would be distributed during times of scarcity. These distribution systems weren't based solely on physical dominance. They incorporated considerations of individual contributions to the collective effort, age, reproductive status, and even personal relationships between individuals. The trade relationships that had developed between different dinosaur communities were creating economic networks that spanned vast geographic areas. Species with access to particular resources would exchange them for materials that were scarce in their own territories. These trading systems weren't simple barter arrangements. They involved complex calculations of relative value and sophisticated credit systems where debts could be carried across multiple transactions. The standardization of trade goods had led to the development of what can only be described as primitive currencies. Certain types of rare minerals, distinctive plant materials, and even manufactured goods were being used as stores of value that could be accumulated and exchanged across different communities. These currency systems were creating new forms of wealth accumulation that influenced social status and reproductive success. The diplomatic protocols that governed intercommunity relationships were remarkably sophisticated, involving elaborate behavioral displays, gift exchanges, and even formal treaty negotiations. These diplomatic activities were preventing conflicts that would have been costly for all parties involved, allowing different communities to coexist peacefully, despite competing for similar resources. The military technologies that had evolved for dealing with conflicts between different communities were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Some species had developed coordinated battle tactics that involved multiple specialized roles, strategic positioning, and even the use of environmental features as tactical advantages. These weren't chaotic brawls. They were carefully planned military operations that required extensive coordination and strategic thinking. The defensive fortifications constructed by some communities were architectural marvels that incorporated multiple lines of defense, strategic choke points, and even early warning systems that could detect approaching threats from considerable distances. These fortifications weren't just physical barriers, they were integrated defense systems that combined architectural elements with behavioral strategies and technological innovations. The intelligence-gathering systems employed by different communities included sophisticated scouting networks, communication relays, and even what appears to have been primitive forms of espionage. These intelligence operations were providing communities with detailed information about resource availability, potential threats, and opportunities for trade or territorial expansion. The medical knowledge that had accumulated within some early Cretaceous communities was remarkably advanced for non-human animals. Some species had learned to identify and use medicinal plants for treating specific ailments, perform basic surgical procedures, and even engage in preventive healthcare practices that reduced disease transmission within their communities. The pharmaceutical knowledge possessed by these medical practitioners included understanding of drug interactions, dosage calculations, and even the development of complex treatment protocols for chronic conditions. This medical knowledge was being preserved and transmitted through specialized training programs where experienced healers would teach their skills to selected individuals within the community. The surgical techniques employed by some species for treating injuries were surprisingly sophisticated, involving sterilization procedures, anesthesia, using natural compounds and even primitive forms of reconstructive surgery. These medical interventions were significantly improving survival rates and quality of life for injured community members. The psychological healing practices that had developed alongside physical medicine included behavioral therapies for treating trauma, social integration programs for individuals who had been isolated, and even primitive forms of counseling for resolving interpersonal conflicts. These psychological interventions were maintaining social cohesion and preventing the breakdown of community relationships under stress. The educational systems that had evolved within some early Cretaceous communities were creating structured learning environments where young animals could acquire the complex skills needed for adult life. These weren't simple imitation behaviors. They were formal educational programs with specialized instructors, standardized curricula, and even assessment procedures to evaluate learning progress. The apprenticeship programs that prepared young animals for specialized roles within their communities involved extended training periods where students would work closely with experienced practitioners. These programs weren't just about skill acquisition. They were comprehensive socialization processes that integrated technical training with cultural education and character development. The research activities conducted by some communities included systematic investigation of environmental phenomena, controlled experiments to test new techniques, and even collaborative research projects that involved multiple communities sharing information and resources. These research efforts were generating new knowledge that was being incorporated into community practices and technologies. The record-keeping systems developed by some species for preserving important information included sophisticated memory techniques, physical markers that conveyed specific meanings, and even primitive forms of writing using natural materials. These record-keeping systems were allowing communities to accumulate knowledge across multiple generations and coordinate complex activities that required precise information management. The artistic traditions that had flourished within early Cretaceous communities were creating cultural identities that distinguished different groups and strengthened social bonds within communities. These artistic expressions weren't just decorative. They were complex communication systems that conveyed historical information, social values, and even technical knowledge in forms that could be easily remembered and transmitted. The musical traditions that had developed included elaborate vocal compositions that served multiple functions within community life. Some songs were used for coordinating group activities, others for transmitting historical information, and still others for expressing emotional states and strengthening social relationships. These musical traditions were becoming increasingly sophisticated, with complex harmonic structures and rhythmic patterns that required considerable skill to perform correctly. The dance traditions associated with various community activities were equally complex, involving choreographed movements that could convey detailed information about everything from weather patterns to territorial boundaries. These dance traditions weren't just entertainment. They were functional communication systems that allowed large groups to coordinate their activities without relying solely on vocal communication. The storytelling traditions that had emerged within some communities were preserving and transmitting crucial cultural knowledge through narrative forms that were both entertaining and educational. These stories weren't simple entertainment. They were sophisticated information storage systems that could preserve complex technical knowledge, historical events, and social values in forms that could be easily remembered and accurately transmitted across generations. The philosophical discussions that took place within some early Cretaceous communities were addressing fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of life, and the proper relationships between different species. These weren't just idle speculation. They were serious intellectual exercises that were influencing community decisions and shaping social institutions. The legal systems that had developed for resolving disputes and maintaining social order were remarkably sophisticated, involving complex procedures for investigating alleged wrongdoing, evaluating evidence, and determining appropriate consequences for various types of misconduct. These legal systems weren't based solely on physical dominance. They incorporated principles of fairness, proportionality, and even rehabilitation that were designed to maintain community harmony while protecting individual rights. The governmental structures that had evolved within some communities included specialized leadership roles, advisory councils, and even primitive forms of democratic decision-making where community members could participate in determining collective policies. These governmental systems weren't simple dominance hierarchies. They were complex political institutions that balanced individual autonomy with collective needs. The economic planning systems employed by some communities included sophisticated resource allocation mechanisms, production scheduling, and even primitive forms of economic forecasting that allowed communities to prepare for future challenges and opportunities. These planning systems were enabling communities to achieve levels of productivity and stability that would have been impossible without systematic coordination. The technological development programs pursued by some communities included systematic research into new materials, manufacturing techniques, and even primitive forms of automation that reduced the labor required for routine tasks. These technological innovations were creating competitive advantages that allowed innovative communities to outperform their neighbors in various aspects of survival and reproduction. The environmental management practices employed by some early Cretaceous communities were creating sustainable relationships with their ecosystems that could be maintained indefinitely without degrading the natural resources on which they depended. These weren't accidental conservation outcomes. They were deliberate management strategies based on sophisticated understanding of ecological principles. The climate modification projects undertaken by some communities included large-scale environmental engineering that could influence local weather patterns, soil conditions, and even the distribution of plant and animal species. These projects weren't just reactive responses to environmental challenges. They were proactive interventions designed to create optimal conditions for community prosperity. The transportation networks developed by some communities included engineered pathways that facilitated rapid movement across difficult terrain, bridge construction that allowed access to previously inaccessible areas, and even primitive forms of mechanical transportation that reduced the energy costs of moving heavy loads over long distances. The communication networks that connected different communities included relay systems that could transmit messages across continental distances, standardized signaling protocols that allowed different communities to communicate effectively despite language differences, and even primitive forms of written communication that could preserve complex information for future reference. The Early Cretaceous period was witnessing the emergence of genuine civilization among non-human species, with levels of social organization, technological sophistication, and cultural development that rivaled those achieved by early human societies. These weren't just impressive individual adaptations. They were comprehensive social systems that were transforming entire ecosystems and creating new forms of evolutionary pressure that were driving even more rapid adaptation and innovation. The competitive pressures created by these advancing civilizations were forcing other species to develop their own innovations or face extinction. The arms race was no longer just about physical adaptations. It had become a competition between different approaches to intelligence, social organization, and technological development. The species that could most effectively combine individual capabilities with collective intelligence were gaining decisive advantages over those that remained dependent on purely biological adaptations. The cultural exchange networks that had developed between different communities were accelerating the pace of innovation by allowing successful adaptations to spread rapidly between groups that might otherwise have remained isolated. These knowledge-sharing systems were creating positive feedback loops, where innovations in one community would inspire further developments in others, leading to exponential increases in the rate of technological and social advancement. The educational exchange programs that allowed young individuals to learn from communities other than their own were creating cosmopolitan perspectives that were breaking down traditional barriers between different groups. These cultural mixing processes were generating hybrid innovations that combined the best features of different traditions, creating solutions that no single community could have developed in isolation. The collaborative research projects that involved multiple communities working together on shared challenges were achieving breakthroughs that were beyond the capabilities of any individual group. These cooperative efforts were demonstrating the power of collective intelligence and establishing precedents for even more ambitious collaborative undertakings. The early Cretaceous world was becoming a laboratory for social and technological experimentation on a scale that had never been seen before in the history of life on Earth. The combination of optimal environmental conditions, abundant resources, and relaxed ecological constraints was allowing multiple species to simultaneously explore the possibilities of advanced civilization. The results were spectacular displays of creativity, innovation, and social sophistication that were transforming the very nature of life on the planet. But this golden age of biological and cultural evolution was building toward an even more remarkable climax. The innovations that had emerged during the early Cretaceous were creating the foundation for developments that would push the boundaries of what was possible even further. The Late Cretaceous period was approaching, and with it would come creatures and civilizations that would represent the absolute pinnacle of evolutionary achievement before the cosmic catastrophe that would end this incredible chapter in the history of life on Earth. The stage was set for the final act in the greatest evolutionary experiment our planet had ever witnessed. The arms race between different forms of intelligence was accelerating. The complexity of social systems was reaching unprecedented heights, and the technological capabilities of various species were approaching levels that would challenge the fundamental constraints that had previously limited terrestrial life. The next phase of this remarkable story would witness the emergence of creatures and civilizations so advanced and specialized that they would seem almost mythical by modern standards. The Late Cretaceous period would represent the ultimate expression of evolutionary potential, the final flowering of biological and cultural diversity before the sudden and catastrophic end that would forever change the course of life on Earth. The dawn of a new age was breaking across the early Cretaceous landscape, and with it came evolutionary pressures that would forge some of the most extraordinary predators our planet has ever known. While the massive herbivores had been perfecting their defensive strategies and social structures, the carnivorous dinosaurs were engaged in their own arms race of predatory innovation. Consider the hunting ground that stretched across what would one day become the American West. Here, in vast floodplains dotted with conifer groves and fern prairies, the most sophisticated predatory behaviors in Earth's history were being refined through countless generations of trial and error. The apex hunters of this world weren't just mindless killing machines. They were strategic thinkers, problem solvers, and masters of psychological warfare. The Tyrannosaurus lineage was still in its developmental stages during the Early Cretaceous, but already these formidable predators were displaying hunting behaviors that would put modern carnivores to shame. Their approach to prey selection was methodical and calculated. Rather than attacking the first potential victim they encountered, these intelligent hunters would observe entire herds for extended periods, studying the behavior patterns of individual animals and identifying the most vulnerable targets. Picture a young Tyrannosaurus positioned downwind from a herd of grazing herbivores, its massive head held low to avoid detection, while its keen eyes cataloged every movement, every behavioral quirk, every sign of weakness among the potential prey. These predators had learned to read the subtle body language that indicated illness, injury, or simply inexperience in dealing with predatory threats. They could distinguish between the confident movements of a healthy adult and the hesitant steps of an animal that was struggling with some hidden weakness. The patience these predators displayed was remarkable. A Tyrannosaurus might shadow a herd for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. They had learned that rushed attacks often resulted in injury or failure, while carefully planned assaults could provide massive payoffs with minimal risk. This wasn't just hunting. It was the application of sophisticated military strategy to the ancient art of predation. But individual hunting was only part of the story. Growing evidence suggests that some early Cretaceous predators had begun experimenting with cooperative hunting strategies that required remarkable levels of communication and coordination. These weren't permanent pack structures like those found in modern wolves. They were temporary alliances formed for specific hunting opportunities that were too large or dangerous for a single predator to handle alone. The formation of these hunting partnerships involved complex negotiations where potential allies would assess each other's capabilities, establish dominance hierarchies, and agree on how the spoils would be divided after a successful hunt. These negotiations weren't simple displays of physical dominance. They involved sophisticated communication systems where different vocalizations, body postures, and even scent markers conveyed detailed information about hunting experience, success rates, and individual specializations. Some predators had evolved to become specialists in particular aspects of cooperative hunting. Certain individuals excelled at tracking and locating prey, using their exceptional sensory capabilities to follow herds across vast distances. Others had developed expertise in herding and driving prey, using their speed and agility to force victims into positions where other hunters could deliver killing attacks. Still others had become specialists in the actual kill, possessing the size and strength needed to bring down the largest prey animals. The coordination required for these cooperative hunts was extraordinary. Multiple predators would position themselves at specific locations around a target herd, maintaining communication through subtle signals while waiting for the optimal moment to launch their coordinated attack. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the prey would scatter before the trap could be sprung. Too late, and the opportunity would be lost as environmental conditions changed or other predators arrived to complicate the situation. The communication systems that facilitated these cooperative hunts were remarkably sophisticated. Different types of calls were used to convey specific tactical information, the location and movement of prey, the readiness of individual hunters, changes in environmental conditions that might affect the hunt, and even abort signals that could call off an attack if conditions became unfavorable. These vocal communication systems were supplemented by visual signals that could be used when silence was essential for maintaining the element of surprise. Subtle changes in body posture, tail position, and head orientation could convey complex information to hunting partners without alerting potential prey to the presence of multiple predators. Some hunting groups had even developed standardized signal systems that allowed individuals who had never worked together before to coordinate their activities effectively. The psychological aspects of these coordinated hunts were perhaps the most remarkable feature of early Cretaceous predatory behavior. These intelligent hunters had learned that fear could be as effective a weapon as teeth and claws. By positioning themselves in ways that created maximum psychological pressure on their prey, they could often trigger panic responses that would cause entire herds to make tactical mistakes that made them more vulnerable to attack. The use of intimidation displays during hunting was a sophisticated psychological technique that required precise timing and coordination. Multiple predators would reveal themselves simultaneously at different points around a herd, creating the impression that the prey was completely surrounded by threats. This coordinated revelation would often cause prey animals to freeze in terror or flee in random directions, making them easy targets for the waiting hunters. Some predatory species had even learned to exploit the defensive behaviors of their prey against them. They understood that herbivorous dinosaurs would instinctively form defensive circles when threatened, with the largest and most powerful individuals on the outside and the young and vulnerable in the center. By carefully timing their attacks, cooperative hunting groups could cause these defensive formations to collapse into chaos, creating opportunities to target the previously protected individuals in the center. The learning processes that allowed these sophisticated hunting behaviors to develop and spread were themselves remarkable examples of animal intelligence. Young predators didn't just inherit hunting instincts from their parents. They participated in extended apprenticeships where they learned the subtle skills needed for successful predation through direct observation and guided practice. These educational processes weren't limited to basic hunting techniques. Young predators were taught to read environmental signs that indicated the presence of prey, to interpret the behavior patterns of different herbivorous species, and to recognize the optimal conditions for different types of hunting strategies. They learned to assess the risks associated with attacking different types of prey, and to make split-second decisions about when to attack, when to retreat, and when to wait for better opportunities. The training methods employed by experienced hunters were remarkably sophisticated. Rather than simply allowing young predators to observe hunts from a distance, mentors would create controlled learning situations where apprentices could practice essential skills without the life-or-death pressure of actual hunting situations. These practice sessions often involved mock hunts, where young predators would stalk and attack inanimate objects, or even willing participants from their own species. The bite force training that young Tyrannosaurus underwent was particularly intensive and systematic. The Fight Club behaviors that paleontologists have identified in the fossil record weren't random acts of aggression. They were carefully structured training programs designed to develop the jaw strength, bite accuracy, and pain tolerance that would be essential for adult hunting success. These training battles followed specific rules that prevented serious injury while still providing realistic combat experience. Young predators would engage in increasingly intense sparring matches as they matured, gradually building the skills and confidence they would need for solitary adult life. The bite marks found on fossilized skulls tell the story of a systematic educational process that was producing some of the most effective predators in Earth's history. The competitive dynamics between different predatory species were driving rapid evolutionary innovation in hunting techniques and physical capabilities. When multiple apex predators occupied the same territory, the competition for prey resources created intense selective pressure for any adaptation that could provide even a slight advantage in hunting success or competitive ability. The rivalry between Tyrannosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus represents one of the most fascinating competitive relationships in the early Cretaceous world. These two apex predators had evolved different approaches to the challenge of being a massive terrestrial carnivore, and their interactions were shaping the evolutionary trajectory of both lineages. Carcharodontosaurus had evolved for maximum size and raw power. These giants relied on their massive bulk and devastating bite force to overwhelm prey through direct assault. Their hunting strategy was based on identifying vulnerable targets and launching devastating attacks that would quickly disable or kill their victims. This approach was highly effective against large, slow-moving herbivores that couldn't escape through speed or agility. Tyrannosaurus, in contrast, had evolved a more balanced approach that combined impressive size with superior agility and intelligence. These predators were more versatile hunters, capable of adapting their techniques to different types of prey and environmental conditions. Their smaller size relative to Carcharodontosaurus was compensated by superior speed, more sophisticated sensory capabilities, and more advanced behavioral flexibility. When these two apex predators encountered each other in the same hunting territory, the interactions were likely spectacular and terrifying. Neither species would back down from a confrontation, as both were accustomed to being the undisputed rulers of their domains. The battles between these titans would have been among the most violent encounters in the history of terrestrial life. The outcome of such confrontations would have depended on numerous factors beyond simple size and strength. The specific environmental conditions, the physical condition of the individual animals, their previous experience with interspecies combat, and even their psychological state at the time of the encounter would all have played crucial roles in determining the victor. Evidence suggests that Tyrannosaurus may have had slight advantages in these confrontations due to their superior agility and more sophisticated fighting techniques. While Carcharodontosaurus possessed greater raw power, Tyrannosaurus had evolved more refined combat skills that allowed them to exploit weaknesses in their opponent's fighting style. The ability to quickly change position, deliver precisely targeted attacks, and avoid the devastating counterattacks that Carcharodontosaurus could deliver may have given Tyrannosaurus the edge in these epic battles. The territorial behaviors that governed the distribution of these apex predators were complex systems that balanced the need for adequate hunting grounds against the costs of defending large territories from competitors. Most large predators maintained territories that were sized to provide sufficient prey resources to support their massive metabolic requirements, while being small enough to patrol effectively and defend against intruders. The boundaries between different predatory territories weren't fixed lines on the landscape. They were dynamic zones that shifted based on seasonal changes in prey availability, environmental conditions, and the relative strength of neighboring predators. These boundary zones often became sites of intense competition where different predators would test each other's resolve and fighting ability. The scent marking systems that predators used to communicate territorial claims were sophisticated chemical communication networks that could convey detailed information about the identity, size, health status, and recent activities of territory holders. These chemical signals weren't just simple warnings to stay away. They were complex messages that allowed predators to assess the risks and benefits of challenging established territory holders. Some predatory species had developed elaborate territorial display behaviors that allowed them to establish and maintain territorial claims without engaging in dangerous physical confrontations. These displays often involved complex combinations of vocalizations, visual signals, and behavioral demonstrations that could convey information about fighting ability while minimizing the risk of actual combat. The seasonal patterns that governed predatory behavior were closely tied to the reproductive cycles and migration patterns of their prey species. Many predators would adjust their territorial boundaries and hunting strategies based on predictable changes in prey availability and distribution. During migration seasons, some predators would temporarily abandon their established territories to follow moving herds, while others would position themselves along traditional migration routes to intercept passing prey. The energy economics of predatory life in the early Cretaceous required careful calculation of costs and benefits for every hunting decision. The massive size of these predators meant that they required enormous amounts of food to maintain their metabolic processes, but their size also made them less efficient hunters than smaller predators. This created a constant tension between the advantages of being large enough to take down massive prey and the disadvantages of requiring massive amounts of food to survive. Successful apex predators had learned to maximize their hunting efficiency by targeting the most nutritious prey available while minimizing the energy expenditure required to make kills. This meant developing preferences for specific types of prey that offered the best return on hunting investment, while avoiding prey species that were too dangerous, too fast, or too well defended to be worth the effort required to kill them. The feeding behaviors of large predators were carefully orchestrated events that maximized the nutritional value extracted from each kill. These weren't chaotic feeding frenzies. They were systematic processing operations where different parts of the carcass were consumed in specific sequences designed to provide optimal nutrition while minimizing waste. Large predators had learned to identify and prioritize the most nutritious parts of their prey, focusing first on organ meats that provided concentrated sources of vitamins and minerals, then moving to muscle tissues that provided protein and energy. The bones and other less digestible materials were often left for scavenging species that had evolved specialized capabilities for processing these tougher materials. The caching behaviors that some predatory species had developed allowed them to preserve food resources for future consumption, reducing the pressure to make frequent kills and allowing them to survive periods when hunting opportunities were limited. These food storage techniques involved selecting optimal storage locations that would preserve meat quality while protecting cached resources from scavenging competitors. The social aspects of feeding were particularly complex when multiple predators had participated in a cooperative hunt. The distribution of food resources among hunting partners required sophisticated negotiation systems that could fairly allocate the spoils based on each individual's contribution to the hunting effort. These distribution systems weren't based solely on physical dominance. They incorporated considerations of hunting skill, effort expended, and even future reciprocal obligations. The scavenging opportunities that supplemented active hunting were an important component of the energy budget for many predatory species. The ability to locate and exploit carcasses that had been killed by other predators, died from natural causes, or been abandoned by their killers required different skills than active hunting, but could provide substantial nutritional benefits with minimal energy expenditure. The competitive dynamics around scavenging opportunities were complex hierarchies that were constantly shifting based on the relative strength and numbers of different species present at each carcass. Large apex predators could usually claim priority access to fresh carcasses, but they had to balance the benefits of scavenging against the risks of confronting other large predators, who might also be interested in the same resources. The timing of scavenging activities was crucial for maximizing nutritional benefits while minimizing competitive risks. Early arrival at a carcass provided access to the highest quality tissues, but also increased the likelihood of confronting the original killer if it was still in the area. Later arrival reduced competitive risks, but also meant access to lower quality food resources that might have already been partially consumed by other scavengers. The sensory capabilities that predators used to locate scavenging opportunities were remarkably sophisticated. The ability to detect the chemical signatures of death and decay from vast distances allowed efficient scavengers to locate feeding opportunities across huge territories. Some species had evolved to specialize in different stages of carcass decomposition, with some preferring fresh kills while others focused on partially decomposed remains that other species found unpalatable. The health and safety considerations associated with scavenging required predators to make careful assessments of food quality and the risks of consuming potentially contaminated materials. The ability to distinguish between safe and dangerous carcasses was essential for avoiding diseases that could be transmitted through consumption of infected tissues. The dental adaptations that different predatory species had evolved reflected their specialized approaches to processing different types of food resources. The massive, bone-crushing teeth of Tyrannosaurus were perfect for processing large carcasses and accessing the nutritious marrow contained within massive bones. The blade-like teeth of Carcharodontosaurus were optimized for slicing through tough hide and muscle tissues with maximum efficiency. The jaw mechanics that supported these different dental adaptations were engineering marvels that maximized bite force while maintaining the precision needed for effective food processing. The muscle arrangements, joint structures, and leverage systems that powered these massive jaws represented some of the most sophisticated biomechanical designs in the history of terrestrial vertebrates. The digestive adaptations that allowed large predators to process massive quantities of meat efficiently were equally remarkable. The stomach capacity, digestive enzyme production, and intestinal processing capabilities of these giants were scaled to handle the enormous food intake required to maintain their massive body size and high metabolic rate. The metabolic strategies that different predatory species employed reflected their particular ecological niches and hunting styles. Some species had evolved high-energy metabolisms that supported active hunting and rapid movement, but required frequent feeding to maintain energy balance. Others had developed more efficient metabolic systems that could sustain them through longer periods between meals, but provided less support for high-intensity activities. The thermoregulation challenges faced by massive predators in the warm Early Cretaceous climate required sophisticated behavioral and physiological adaptations. The problem of preventing overheating while maintaining the high activity levels required for successful hunting was a constant challenge that influenced everything from daily activity patterns to habitat selection. The behavioral thermoregulation strategies employed by large predators included careful timing of hunting activities to avoid the hottest parts of the day, selection of hunting territories that provided adequate shade and cooling opportunities, and even the use of water resources for active cooling when environmental temperatures became extreme. The social thermoregulation behaviors that some species employed included coordinated resting in shaded areas where multiple individuals could benefit from shared cooling strategies. These temporary social aggregations weren't permanent group formations, but they represented sophisticated solutions to environmental challenges that required coordination between normally solitary animals. The reproductive strategies of apex predators were carefully balanced systems that maximized reproductive success while maintaining the territorial and hunting capabilities needed for adult survival. The timing of reproductive activities, the selection of mates, and the provision of parental care all required careful consideration of energy allocation and resource availability. The courtship behaviors that preceded mating were elaborate displays that allowed potential partners to assess each other's fitness, genetic quality, and parenting potential. These courtship displays weren't just simple dominance contests. They were complex behavioral evaluations that incorporated multiple criteria for mate selection and required considerable time and energy investment from both participants. The nesting behaviors of predatory species were sophisticated construction projects that provided optimal conditions for egg incubation while protecting developing embryos from environmental threats and potential predators. The selection of nest sites, the construction of protective structures, and the maintenance of optimal incubation conditions required extensive knowledge of environmental factors and considerable behavioral flexibility. The parental care behaviors that some predatory species provided to their offspring were remarkably sophisticated systems that maximized offspring survival while teaching essential survival skills. These weren't just protective behaviors. They were comprehensive educational programs that prepared young predators for the challenges of adult life in competitive ecosystems. The Early Cretaceous period was witnessing the emergence of predatory behaviors and capabilities that represented the pinnacle of terrestrial carnivore evolution. The combination of intelligence, physical capability, and behavioral sophistication that characterized the apex predators of this period created hunting systems that were more effective and efficient than anything that had existed before or would exist again. These remarkable predators were operating in ecosystems of unprecedented complexity and productivity, creating competitive pressures that were driving rapid evolutionary innovation across all trophic levels. The arms race between predators and prey was reaching new heights of sophistication, with each side developing increasingly advanced adaptations in response to the evolutionary innovations of their opponents. The stage was being set for even more remarkable developments as the Early Cretaceous period progressed toward its climax. The predatory dynasties that were being established during this golden age of terrestrial carnivores would continue to evolve and diversify, eventually producing creatures that would push the boundaries of predatory capability to their absolute limits before the catastrophic events that would end this remarkable chapter in the history of life on Earth. The mastery these apex predators achieved in reading their environment was nothing short of extraordinary. A seasoned Tyrannosaurus could detect the slightest change in herd dynamics from remarkable distances, sensing when a normally confident herbivore was favoring one leg or displaying the subtle behavioral changes that indicated internal illness. These weren't random observations. They were systematic intelligence-gathering operations that could determine the difference between a successful hunt and a potentially fatal encounter with a healthy, fully capable defender. The psychological warfare these predators employed extended far beyond simple intimidation. They had learned to manipulate the natural behaviors of their prey in ways that seem almost calculated. By positioning themselves at specific locations and times, they could trigger stampedes that would separate individuals from the protective embrace of their herds. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and the herd would have time to reorganize their defenses. Too late, and the opportunity would vanish as environmental conditions shifted or competing predators arrived to complicate the situation. Picture the moment when a Carcharodontosaurus would emerge from concealment at precisely the right instant to cause maximum chaos among a grazing herd. The psychological impact was devastating. These massive herbivores, despite their own impressive size and defensive capabilities, would experience a primal terror that could override their usually effective group coordination systems. In those crucial seconds of panic, the predator could identify and pursue the most vulnerable target while the rest of the herd was still processing the threat. But the most remarkable aspect of early Cretaceous predatory behavior was the evidence for what can only be described as strategic thinking that extended across multiple hunting cycles. These predators weren't just reacting to immediate opportunities. They were planning campaigns that could span weeks or even months, gradually positioning themselves for optimal hunting success during predictable seasonal events. The migration seasons provided the greatest opportunities for these strategic approaches. Experienced predators had learned the traditional routes that different herbivore species would follow as they tracked optimal feeding conditions across the continent. Rather than simply following these migrations, the smartest hunters would position themselves at strategic choke points along the routes, waiting for the herds to come to them. These ambush positions weren't chosen randomly. They represented the culmination of generations of accumulated knowledge about animal behavior, terrain features, and environmental factors that could influence the success of hunting attempts. A prime ambush site might be used by successive generations of predators, with the knowledge of its location and optimal utilization being passed down through cultural transmission systems that rivaled those found in modern intelligent species. The construction and maintenance of these hunting territories required sophisticated understanding of landscape features and their effects on both predator and prey behavior. Some predators had learned to modify their environments in subtle ways that increased their hunting success rates. Fallen logs might be positioned to funnel prey movement in specific directions. Natural barriers could be enhanced to create better concealment for waiting hunters. Even vegetation patterns could be influenced through selective feeding that created optimal sight lines and approach routes. The energy management strategies that governed these extended hunting campaigns were remarkably sophisticated. Large predators had learned to balance their metabolic requirements against the unpredictable nature of hunting success, developing feeding schedules that could sustain them through extended periods of unsuccessful hunting, while maintaining the physical condition needed for explosive action when opportunities arose. The social dynamics that emerged around prime hunting territories created complex hierarchies that were constantly shifting based on seasonal changes and individual circumstances. During peak hunting seasons, even normally, solitary predators might tolerate the presence of others in their territories if the abundance of prey made competition less intense. These temporary truces required sophisticated negotiation systems that could establish temporary territorial boundaries and feeding rights without escalating into destructive conflicts. The communication systems that facilitated these complex social arrangements included long-distance vocalizations that could convey information about territorial claims, hunting success, and willingness to engage in cooperative activities. These weren't simple threat displays. They were nuanced communication systems that could convey detailed information about individual intentions and capabilities across vast distances. Some of the most remarkable evidence for advanced predatory intelligence comes from what appears to be tool use in hunting contexts. Scratch marks on certain fossils suggest that some theropods learned to use environmental features as aids in processing their prey. Rocks might be used to crack open particularly tough bones to access nutritious marrow. Fallen branches could serve as levers to position heavy carcasses for optimal access to choice cuts of meat. The implications of tool use among early Cretaceous predators extend far beyond simple mechanical assistance. It suggests levels of problem-solving ability and forward planning that were previously thought to be limited to much more recent evolutionary developments. The ability to recognize that an environmental object could be modified or repositioned to achieve a desired outcome represents a cognitive breakthrough that fundamentally changes our understanding of dinosaur intelligence. The teaching behaviors that allowed these tool use techniques to spread within predator populations were themselves remarkable displays of intelligence and social sophistication. Experienced hunters would demonstrate techniques to younger individuals not through simple mimicry opportunities, but through deliberate instructional sessions where the teacher would slow down their movements and repeat actions until the student had mastered the technique. These educational processes weren't limited to immediate family members. Some evidence suggests that predators would adopt orphaned juveniles from other families, providing them with the training needed to survive as adults. This kind of cross-family adoption behavior requires levels of empathy and social awareness that challenge our assumptions about reptilian emotional capabilities. The memory systems that supported these complex behaviors were extraordinary in their capacity and precision. Individual predators could remember specific hunting locations, successful techniques, and even the behavioral patterns of particular prey individuals across multiple hunting seasons. This kind of long-term memory storage and retrieval system was essential for the strategic approaches that characterized the most successful hunters. The mental mapping capabilities that allowed predators to navigate vast territories and return to specific locations after extended absences were equally impressive. These weren't simple landmark-based navigation systems. They were sophisticated spatial reasoning capabilities that could integrate multiple types of environmental information to maintain precise positional awareness across continental-scale territories. The problem-solving abilities that these predators displayed when confronted with novel hunting challenges were remarkable for their creativity and flexibility. When traditional techniques failed, the most intelligent hunters could develop entirely new approaches that incorporated elements from their existing behavioral repertoire in innovative ways. This behavioral flexibility was crucial for success in the constantly changing competitive landscape of early Cretaceous ecosystems. The emotional intelligence that governed social interactions between predators was far more sophisticated than previously imagined. The ability to read and respond appropriately to the emotional states of other predators was essential for successful cooperation in hunting partnerships and for avoiding unnecessary conflicts during competitive encounters. The stress management techniques that predators employed to maintain optimal performance under the intense pressure of life-or-death hunting situations included sophisticated relaxation behaviors, territorial rituals that reduced anxiety, and even what appears to be primitive forms of play that helped maintain psychological health during periods of hunting failure. The competitive intelligence gathering that predators engaged in to monitor the activities and capabilities of rival hunters was a constant background activity that influenced everything from territorial decisions to hunting strategy selection. The ability to assess the relative strengths and weaknesses of competing predators was essential for making informed decisions about when to compete directly and when to avoid confrontation. The innovation cycles that characterized predatory behavior development were driven by the constant pressure to stay ahead of both prey adaptations and competitor capabilities. New techniques that provided even slight advantages would spread rapidly through predator populations, creating evolutionary arms races that accelerated the pace of behavioral innovation across entire ecosystems. The specialization trends that emerged among different predator lineages were creating increasingly refined approaches to the challenges of large-scale terrestrial predation. Some species were becoming ultra-specialists in particular types of prey or hunting conditions, while others were developing generalist capabilities that allowed them to exploit a wider range of opportunities with slightly lower efficiency. The environmental adaptation strategies that predators employed to maintain their effectiveness across different seasonal conditions and habitat types were remarkably flexible systems that could be adjusted based on changing circumstances. The ability to modify hunting techniques, territorial patterns, and social behaviors in response to environmental changes was crucial for survival in the dynamic Early Cretaceous world. The technological innovation processes that were driving the development of increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques were creating positive feedback loops, where each advance enabled further advances in a continuous cycle of improvement. The cumulative effect of these innovations was producing hunting systems that were approaching the theoretical limits of what was possible for terrestrial carnivores. The cultural transmission mechanisms that allowed successful innovations to spread between different predator populations were creating shared knowledge bases that transcended individual lifespans and even species boundaries. Successful techniques developed by one group could spread to others through observation, adoption, and gradual refinement processes that accelerated the overall pace of predatory evolution. The quality control systems that governed the adoption and refinement of new hunting techniques were sophisticated evaluation processes that could distinguish between genuinely useful innovations and potentially dangerous novelties. The ability to test new approaches in low-risk situations before incorporating them into critical hunting activities was essential for maintaining the high success rates that characterize the most effective predators. The research and development activities that some predator communities engaged in included systematic experimentation with new techniques, controlled testing of environmental modifications, and even collaborative investigation of prey behavior patterns. These weren't accidental discoveries. They were deliberate attempts to expand the boundaries of predatory capability through systematic inquiry and experimentation. The performance optimization strategies that individual predators employed to maximize their hunting effectiveness included sophisticated training regimens, dietary management, and even primitive forms of equipment maintenance for predators that used tools or environmental modifications in their hunting activities. The risk management systems that governed predatory decision-making were complex evaluation processes that could weigh the potential benefits of different hunting opportunities against their associated risks. The ability to make these calculations quickly and accurately under pressure was one of the most crucial skills that separated successful predators from those that didn't survive to reproductive age. the success metrics that predators use to evaluate their own performance and adjust their strategies. Accordingly, were sophisticated self-assessment systems that incorporated multiple factors beyond simple kill rates. Energy efficiency, injury avoidance, territorial security, and even social status were all factors that influenced strategic decision-making in complex ways. The legacy planning behaviors that some predators engaged in to ensure the continuation of their territorial holdings and hunting traditions after their deaths were remarkable displays of forward thinking that extended their influence beyond their individual lifespans. The preparation of younger predators to inherit established territories and the preservation of crucial knowledge through teaching and demonstration were creating continuity systems that maintained predatory effectiveness across generations. The competitive advantage system that emerged from these various innovations were creating hierarchies of predatory effectiveness that were constantly shifting as different groups developed new capabilities or lost ground to more innovative competitors. The most successful predator lineages were those that could most effectively combine individual excellence with collective intelligence and cultural continuity. The ecosystem impact assessments that the most intelligent predators were capable of making allowed them to understand how their hunting activities affected the broader environmental systems on which they depended. This systems thinking was enabling sustainable hunting practices that could maintain productivity over extended periods without depleting the prey resources that supported the entire ecosystem. The collaborative research networks that were emerging between different predator communities were creating unprecedented opportunities for sharing knowledge and coordinating activities across vast geographic areas. These networks weren't formal institutions, but they were functional information sharing systems that were accelerating innovation and improving hunting success rates across entire continental regions. The mentorship programs that experienced predators were developing to train the next generation were comprehensive educational systems that went far beyond basic survival skills to include advanced hunting techniques, environmental management, and even primitive forms of leadership development. These programs were creating more capable predators while also preserving and transmitting the accumulated knowledge of previous generations. The strategic planning capabilities that characterized the most advanced predator communities were enabling long-term approaches to territorial management, resource development, and competitive positioning that extended across multiple generations. These weren't short-term survival strategies. They were comprehensive approaches to maintaining predatory dominance over extended periods in highly competitive environments. The early Cretaceous predators had achieved levels of individual capability and collective organization that represented the absolute pinnacle of terrestrial carnivore evolution. Their hunting systems were more sophisticated, their social organizations more complex, and their environmental management more effective than anything that had existed before or would exist again in the history of terrestrial predators. But even as these magnificent hunters were perfecting their craft, the world around them was continuing to change in ways that would ultimately challenge even their remarkable adaptability. The Late Cretaceous period was approaching, and with it would come environmental pressures and competitive challenges that would test the limits of predatory capability and drive the evolution of even more extreme specializations. The stage was being set for the final act in the greatest predatory arms race in Earth's history, where the innovations of the Early Cretaceous would serve as the foundation for developments that would push the boundaries of what was biologically possible to their absolute limits before the cosmic catastrophe that would end this incredible evolutionary experiment forever. The foundations of predatory excellence that had been established during the Early Cretaceous were about to face their greatest test. As environmental conditions continued to shift and prey, species developed increasingly sophisticated defensive strategies. The arms race between hunter and hunted was entering its most intense phase. The cooling trend that had characterized the early part of this period was beginning to reverse, setting the stage for dramatic climatic changes that would reshape entire ecosystems. Rising global temperatures were creating new environmental pressures that would challenge even the most adaptable species. The shallow seas that had provided stable coastal environments were starting to fluctuate more dramatically, while continental interiors were experiencing increasingly extreme weather patterns. These environmental shifts weren't just background changes that species could ignore. They were fundamental alterations to the basic conditions that had supported the incredible diversity and abundance of early Cretaceous life. The predators that had mastered the art of hunting in stable, predictable environments would now need to adapt their techniques to succeed in a world of increasing variability and uncertainty. The herbivorous giants that had provided reliable prey for the apex predators were themselves facing new challenges. The plant communities that supported these massive animals were beginning to change as flowering plants started their slow but inevitable rise to dominance. These early angiosperms weren't just adding new options to the menu. They were fundamentally altering the nutritional landscape in ways that would affect every aspect of herbivore behavior and distribution. The Early Cretaceous period stands as one of the most extraordinary chapters in our planet's biological history, a 45 million year testament to the incredible potential of evolutionary experimentation. From the towering Mamenchisaurus reaching toward ancient canopies to the armored fortresses of Ankylosaurus, from the lightning-fast Struthiomimus to the apex predators that ruled through intelligence and devastating power, this was life pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible. These weren't just bigger versions of familiar animals. They were entirely new approaches to existence, creatures that had solved the challenges of survival in ways that continue to astound us today. As we move forward into the Late Cretaceous period, we'll discover that this golden age